Before we delve into this chilling tale from the heart of 1894 New Orleans, I want to connect with our global community of truth seekers. Please take a moment to share in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is in your corner of the world. Are you settling in for an evening of historical mysteries, perhaps listening during your commute? Or are you one of those dedicated investigators who explores these dark chapters late into the night? Your engagement helps us understand how these forgotten stories continue to resonate across continents and time zones, reminding us that the pursuit of truth knows no boundaries. Our story begins with what appeared to be nothing more than a routine health inspection complaint filed with the New Orleans Board of Health on October 12, 1894. Inspector Theodore Blanchard had received reports of unusual odors emanating from a well-regarded Creole restaurant in the French Quarter, complaints that might normally have been dismissed as the typical concerns of tourists unaccustomed to the rich aromas of authentic Louisiana cuisine. However, when Inspector Blanchard arrived at the establishment known as Chez Boudreau on Royal Street, he discovered something that would haunt him for the remainder of his days and expose one of the most horrifying cases of systematic murder and cannibalism in American history. The restaurant, housed in a magnificent three-story Creole mansion built in the 1820s, had been serving what locals considered the finest traditional cuisine in the French Quarter for nearly 15 years. The building itself was a masterpiece of Louisiana architecture, with its distinctive wrought iron balconies, French doors opening onto the street, and the characteristic Creole color scheme of soft yellow walls with dark green shutters. What Inspector Blanchard found in the basement kitchen of this seemingly respectable establishment would reveal that the Boudreau family had been serving their patrons far more than the jambalaya, gumbo, and other Creole delicacies that had made their restaurant famous throughout New Orleans and beyond. To understand how such unthinkable horrors could unfold in one of America's most civilized cities, we must first immerse ourselves in the unique world of 1894 New Orleans, particularly the French Quarter, which even then was recognized as the cultural and culinary heart of the city. The Vieux Carré, as locals called it, was a labyrinth of narrow streets lined with buildings that reflected the city's complex colonial heritage, where French, Spanish, African, and Caribbean influences had blended to create something entirely unique in the American experience. The neighborhood was home to approximately 25,000 residents, making it one of the most densely populated areas in the South, a fact that would prove crucial to understanding how the Boudreau family's crimes could continue undetected for so many years. The New Orleans of 1894 was a city in transition, still recovering from the devastation of the Civil War and Reconstruction while simultaneously experiencing a cultural and economic renaissance that would define its character for generations to come. The population had grown to nearly 300,000 people, making it the largest city in the South and one of the most cosmopolitan in America. The French Quarter served as the commercial and social center of this diverse metropolis, where cotton merchants conducted business worth millions of dollars, where opera houses and theaters presented world-class entertainment, and where restaurants like Chez Boudreau catered to an increasingly sophisticated clientele that included wealthy planters, international businessmen, and curious tourists from across America and Europe. The culinary landscape of 1890s New Orleans was unlike anywhere else in America, a reflection of the city's unique cultural heritage and its position as a major port connecting the American interior with the Caribbean and Europe. Creole cuisine, which had evolved from the fusion of French cooking techniques with Spanish, African, and Native American ingredients and traditions, was reaching new heights of sophistication and recognition. Restaurants in the French Quarter competed fiercely to attract patrons with increasingly elaborate and exotic dishes, often claiming secret family recipes passed down through generations of Creole cooks. This competitive environment, combined with the relative isolation of individual restaurant kitchens and the limited food safety regulations of the era, created conditions where unscrupulous operators could engage in practices that would have been impossible in more regulated environments. The physical environment of the French Quarter in 1894 played a crucial role in the events that would unfold. The neighborhood's architecture, with its high walls, interior courtyards, and buildings that shared walls and often connected through hidden passages, provided numerous opportunities for concealment and clandestine activities. The narrow streets, many of which were still unpaved and poorly lit, created an atmosphere of intimacy and secrecy that could hide a multitude of sins. The constant presence of delivery wagons, street vendors, and the general bustle of commercial activity meant that unusual sounds, smells, or activities could easily be attributed to legitimate business operations. The building that housed Chez Boudreau was typical of the grand Creole mansions that lined Royal Street, one of the French Quarter's most prestigious addresses. Constructed in 1823 by a wealthy sugar planter named Etienne Marigny, the three-story structure featured the classic Creole architectural elements that made New Orleans unique: a raised ground floor to protect against flooding, tall French doors that opened onto wrought iron balconies, and a complex system of interior courtyards and dependencies that provided privacy and protection from the subtropical climate. The building's basement, which would later prove central to our story, was unusual for New Orleans construction, having been built with imported stone and designed to serve as both storage space and, during the summer months, a cool retreat from the oppressive heat and humidity. The restaurant occupied the entire ground floor and part of the second floor of the mansion, with the family's living quarters located on the upper floors and in the rear dependencies. The main dining room, which could accommodate nearly 60 patrons, was elegantly appointed with crystal chandeliers, mahogany furniture, and artwork that reflected the sophisticated tastes of New Orleans high society. The kitchen, located in the basement and connected to the dining room by a dumbwaiter system, was considered one of the most modern and well-equipped in the city, featuring the latest in cooking technology including gas-fired stoves, iceboxes, and a complex ventilation system that was supposed to eliminate cooking odors from the dining areas above. Into this world of culinary sophistication and cultural refinement stepped the Boudreau family, who would become the proprietors of what many considered the finest Creole restaurant in New Orleans. The family patriarch, Jean-Baptiste Boudreau, was a man whose background seemed perfectly suited to the restaurant business, though later investigations would reveal that much of his personal history had been carefully fabricated. According to the story he told to neighbors, customers, and business associates, Jean-Baptiste was the descendant of a prominent Creole family that had owned sugar plantations in St. Bernard Parish before losing their land during the economic upheavals that followed the Civil War. Jean-Baptiste was a man of imposing physical presence, standing nearly 6.5 feet tall with the broad shoulders and powerful build of someone accustomed to physical labor. His appearance was striking, café-au-lait skin that reflected his mixed racial heritage, piercing black eyes that seemed to miss nothing, and prematurely gray hair that he wore slicked back in the fashion of successful businessmen of the era. He possessed a commanding voice that could be heard clearly throughout the restaurant's dining room, and he had cultivated the mannerisms and speech patterns of the Creole aristocracy, speaking French as fluently as English and peppering his conversation with the cultural references and social connections that established his credibility among New Orleans society. His wife, Marie-Celeste Boudreau, was equally impressive in her own way, a woman whose beauty and charm had made her a favorite among the restaurant's clientele. Born Marie-Celeste Thibodeau in 1852, she claimed to be the daughter of a prominent family from Lafayette Parish, though like her husband's background, this story would later prove to be largely fictional. She was a petite woman with the delicate features and graceful movements that were prized among Creole women of her generation. Her dark hair was always elaborately styled, and she dressed in the latest fashions imported from Paris, creating an image of sophistication and refinement that perfectly complemented the restaurant's elegant atmosphere. Marie-Celeste served as the restaurant's hostess and manager, greeting patrons with a warmth and charm that made them feel like honored guests in a private home rather than customers in a commercial establishment. She possessed a remarkable memory for names, faces, and personal details, allowing her to create the impression of genuine personal interest in each patron's welfare. Her knowledge of Creole cuisine was encyclopedic, and she could discuss the history and preparation of any dish on the menu with the authority of someone who had grown up in the tradition. She also claimed to possess some of the spiritual gifts common among Creole women of her generation, occasionally offering to read palms or provide spiritual guidance to patrons who seemed troubled or seeking direction in their lives. The couple's 3 children also played important roles in the restaurant's operation, though their involvement would later prove to have sinister implications. Their eldest son, Auguste, was 22 years old in 1894 and served as the restaurant's primary chef, having supposedly learned the art of Creole cooking from his grandmother and other family members. Auguste was a quiet, intense young man who rarely spoke to patrons but whose culinary creations had earned the restaurant much of its reputation for excellence. He had inherited his father's imposing physical presence and his mother's attention to detail, creating dishes that were not only delicious but also beautifully presented. Their daughter, Celestine, was 19 and served as a waitress and assistant to her mother in managing the dining room. She had inherited her mother's beauty and charm, but there was something unsettling about her demeanor that some patrons found disturbing. She had a habit of staring at customers with an intensity that made them uncomfortable, and she seemed to take particular interest in patrons who dined alone or appeared to be traveling without companions. Several regular customers later reported that Celestine had asked unusually detailed questions about their travel plans, family situations, and business affairs, inquiries that seemed excessive even by the standards of Southern hospitality. The youngest child, Pierre, was 17 and worked primarily in the kitchen and storage areas, handling the procurement and preparation of ingredients that he was responsible for the restaurant's relationships with local suppliers, including the butchers, fishermen, and farmers who provided the fresh ingredients that were essential to authentic Creole cuisine. Pierre was known for his ability to obtain unusual or hard-to-find ingredients, often surprising patrons with dishes featuring exotic meats or rare delicacies that other restaurants couldn't provide. His knowledge of food preparation and preservation was remarkable for someone his age, and he had developed innovative techniques for aging and curing meats that contributed significantly to the distinctive flavors that made Chez Boudreau's cuisine so memorable. The restaurant had opened in 1879, when Jean-Baptiste had purchased the Royal Street mansion from the estate of its previous owner, a cotton merchant who had died suddenly of yellow fever. The family had invested heavily in renovating the building and equipping the kitchen with the finest available equipment, creating an establishment that quickly gained a reputation for excellence among New Orleans' discerning diners. Within 5 years, Chez Boudreau had become one of the most sought-after dining destinations in the French Quarter, attracting not only local patrons but also visitors from across the South and beyond who had heard about the restaurant's exceptional cuisine. The menu at Chez Boudreau featured all the classic dishes of Creole cuisine, gumbo, jambalaya, étouffée, and various preparations of seafood, poultry, and game, but the family had also developed several signature dishes that were available nowhere else in New Orleans. These specialties, which Auguste claimed were based on secret family recipes, included a particularly rich and flavorful jambalaya that featured what the family described as a special blend of meats and spices, a gumbo with an unusually complex and satisfying flavor profile, and various meat dishes that patrons described as unlike anything they had ever tasted. The restaurant's wine cellar was also exceptional, featuring rare vintages from France and other European countries that complemented the rich flavors of Creole cuisine perfectly. The success of Chez Boudreau was reflected not only in its financial prosperity but also in its social significance within New Orleans society. The restaurant had become a gathering place for the city's elite, where business deals were negotiated, political alliances were formed, and social connections were established and maintained. Regular patrons included prominent merchants, politicians, professionals, and visiting dignitaries who appreciated both the quality of the cuisine and the discretion that the Boudreau family provided. The restaurant's reputation for confidentiality made it a popular venue for sensitive business discussions and romantic assignations, a fact that would later prove significant to understanding how the family's crimes could continue undetected. The first indication that something might be amiss at Chez Boudreau came in the spring of 1894, when several regular patrons began to notice subtle changes in the restaurant's atmosphere and operations. Dr. Armand Thibodeau, a prominent physician who dined at the restaurant weekly, later testified that he had become concerned about the increasing number of patrons who seemed to disappear from New Orleans society after dining at Chez Boudreau. These were typically visitors to the city, traveling businessmen, tourists, or individuals who had come to New Orleans seeking new opportunities, who would dine at the restaurant and then seemingly vanish without completing their business or returning to their hotels. The pattern was subtle and might have been attributed to the normal mobility of travelers and business people, but Dr. Thibodeau had begun to notice that these disappearances often involved individuals who had dined alone and had engaged in extended conversations with members of the Boudreau family. He also observed that these patrons often appeared to be wealthy or to be carrying significant amounts of cash or valuable items, details that he had noticed because of his position as a prominent member of New Orleans society and his natural tendency to observe the people around him. Mrs. Octavia Landry, a wealthy widow who was a regular patron of the restaurant, had also begun to notice disturbing patterns in the behavior of the Boudreau family. She later testified that Celestine had begun asking increasingly personal questions about her family's situation, financial affairs, and social connections, inquiries that seemed to go far beyond normal conversation. Mrs. Landry had also observed that certain patrons seemed to receive special attention from the family, being invited to tour the restaurant's facilities or to sample special dishes that were not available to other customers. The most disturbing observation came from Mr. Charles Rousseau, a cotton merchant who had been dining at Chez Boudreau for several years, that he reported that on several occasions, he had heard unusual sounds coming from the basement kitchen during his meals, sounds that seemed inconsistent with normal food preparation activities. These sounds, which he described as heavy dragging noises and occasional muffled cries, had initially been explained by Jean-Baptiste as the sounds of moving heavy equipment or dealing with difficult deliveries, but Mr. Rousseau had begun to suspect that something more sinister might be occurring. The investigation that would ultimately expose the Boudreau family's crimes began almost by accident, when Inspector Theodore Blanchard received a complaint about unusual odors coming from the restaurant. The complaint had been filed by Mrs. Adelaide Marigny, who operated a boarding house adjacent to the restaurant and had become concerned about smells that seemed to be coming from the Chez Boudreau building. Mrs. Marigny described the odors as unlike anything associated with normal cooking, more reminiscent of the smells she remembered from her childhood when her family had butchered livestock on their plantation. Inspector Blanchard was a conscientious public servant who took his responsibilities seriously, but he initially approached the investigation with the assumption that he would find nothing more than poor ventilation or inadequate waste disposal. Theodore Blanchard was a native New Orleanian who had worked for the Board of Health for nearly 10 years, conducting routine inspections of restaurants, hotels, and other establishments that served the public. He was familiar with the normal operations of commercial kitchens and had dealt with numerous complaints about odors, sanitation, and food safety that had typically been resolved through minor adjustments to procedures or equipment. When Inspector Blanchard arrived at Chez Boudreau on the morning of October 12, 1894, he was greeted by Jean-Baptiste Boudreau, who seemed surprised but cooperative about the inspection. Jean-Baptiste explained that the restaurant had recently been experimenting with new preservation techniques for their meats, including some traditional Creole methods that involved aging and curing processes that might produce unfamiliar odors. He offered to provide a complete tour of the facilities and to explain any procedures that might be causing concern among the neighbors. The main floor of the restaurant appeared to be in excellent condition, with clean dining areas, properly maintained equipment, and no obvious sources of unusual odors. The family's living quarters on the upper floors were also well maintained and showed no signs of problems. However, when Inspector Blanchard requested to examine the basement kitchen, he noticed a subtle change in Jean-Baptiste's demeanor, a momentary hesitation and a slight tension in his voice as he agreed to provide access to the lower level of the building. The basement kitchen was indeed impressive, featuring modern equipment and what appeared to be excellent sanitation practices. However, Inspector Blanchard immediately noticed the source of the odors that had prompted the complaint, a smell that was indeed unlike anything associated with normal food preparation. The odor was complex and disturbing, combining elements that suggested decomposition, unusual spices, and something else that he couldn't immediately identify, but that made him profoundly uncomfortable. When Inspector Blanchard asked about the source of the odors, Auguste Boudreau, who had been working in the kitchen, explained that they were experimenting with traditional Creole techniques for preparing and preserving exotic meats, including some game animals and imported delicacies that required special handling. He showed the inspector several large containers that he claimed contained various meats in different stages of preparation, but he was reluctant to open them, explaining that exposure to air could ruin the curing process and result in significant financial loss. Inspector Blanchard's suspicions were aroused by the family's evasive responses to his questions and by certain details he observed in the basement kitchen. That he noticed that the ventilation system, while modern and well-designed, seemed to be operating at capacity, as if it were dealing with much larger volumes of odors than would be produced by normal cooking operations. He also observed that certain areas of the basement floor showed signs of recent cleaning with strong chemicals, and that there were stains on the walls and ceiling that suggested the regular presence of substances that were not typically associated with food preparation. Most disturbing, Inspector Blanchard noticed several items in the kitchen that seemed inconsistent with normal restaurant operations. These included unusually large knives and cleavers, containers that appeared to be designed for holding much larger quantities of meat than would be needed for daily restaurant service, and what appeared to be specialized equipment for processing carcasses. When he asked about these items, Pierre Boudreau explained that the restaurant occasionally catered large events that required the preparation of whole animals, and that they also supplied certain specialty meats to other restaurants and private customers. The breakthrough in Inspector Blanchard's investigation came when he noticed something that the Boudreau family had apparently overlooked in their preparations for his visit. That in one corner of the basement, partially hidden behind a stack of supply containers, was a pile of clothing and personal effects that seemed inconsistent with the restaurant's operations. The items included men's and women's clothing of good quality, jewelry, watches, and personal documents that appeared to belong to different individuals. When Inspector Blanchard asked about these items, the family's explanations became increasingly contradictory and implausible. Jean-Baptiste claimed that the items belonged to customers who had left them behind and that the family was holding them until the owners returned to claim them. However, the quantity and variety of items, as well as their condition, suggested that they had been there for extended periods and that their owners were unlikely to return for them. Inspector Blanchard's growing suspicions led him to examine the basement more carefully, and he soon discovered evidence that would transform his routine health inspection into a criminal investigation. Behind a false wall in one corner of the basement, he found a room that had been designed for purposes that had nothing to do with food preparation for restaurant patrons. The room contained equipment and materials that suggested systematic butchering operations on a scale far beyond what would be needed for normal restaurant service. The most horrifying discovery came when Inspector Blanchard found human remains in various stages of processing, along with evidence that the Boudreau family had been systematically murdering selected patrons and incorporating their flesh into the restaurant's signature dishes. The specialized jambalaya and gumbo that had made Chez Boudreau famous throughout New Orleans had been prepared using human meat, carefully seasoned and prepared to disguise its true nature while providing the distinctive flavors that had attracted so many satisfied customers. The scope of the Boudreau family's crimes became clear as Inspector Blanchard's initial discoveries led to a full criminal investigation conducted by Detective Captain James Morrison and a team of experienced investigators. The evidence revealed that the family had been systematically selecting victims from among their restaurant patrons, targeting individuals who met specific criteria that made them ideal for their purposes. The victims were typically travelers or visitors to New Orleans who had limited local connections, possessed valuable items or significant amounts of cash, and were dining alone or in circumstances that made their disappearance less likely to be immediately noticed. The selection process was sophisticated and carefully planned. Family members would engage potential victims in conversation during their meals, gathering information about their travel plans, family situations, business affairs, and financial resources. Patrons who appeared to be wealthy, isolated, and unlikely to be missed in the immediate future would be invited to return for special meals or private dining experiences that would provide opportunities for the family to act against them. The murder method employed by the Boudreau family was both efficient and difficult to detect. Marie Celeste, who possessed knowledge of herbal preparations and folk medicine common among Creole women of her generation, had developed a mixture of plant extracts that could be added to food or drink to render victims unconscious without producing obvious symptoms of poisoning. The mixture, which included extracts from several plants native to Louisiana, would cause victims to lose consciousness gradually, creating the appearance of someone who had simply had too much to drink or who was suffering from fatigue or illness. Once victims were unconscious, they would be moved to the hidden room in the basement, where Auguste and Pierre would complete the murder and begin the process of preparing the bodies for incorporation into the restaurant's menu. The family had developed sophisticated techniques for butchering human remains and processing the meat in ways that disguised its true nature while maximizing its culinary value. Different cuts were used for different dishes, with the choicest portions being reserved for the restaurant's most expensive and sought-after specialties. The investigation revealed that the Boudreau family had been operating their cannibalistic restaurant for nearly 15 years, during which time they had murdered at least 37 people, though the actual number may have been significantly higher. The victims included traveling businessmen, tourists, individuals seeking new opportunities in New Orleans, and even some local residents who had become isolated from their families and communities. The systematic nature of the crimes, combined with the family's sophisticated methods for selecting victims and disposing of evidence, had allowed them to operate undetected for an extraordinarily long period. The financial motivation for the crimes was substantial, as the family had not only been profiting from their restaurant operations but had also been systematically robbing their victims of cash, jewelry, and other valuables. The investigation revealed that the Boudreaux family had accumulated wealth far beyond what could be explained by legitimate restaurant income, including property, investments, and valuable items that had clearly been obtained through their criminal activities. The psychological analysis of the Boudreaux family, conducted by Dr. Samuel Cartwright and other medical experts, revealed individuals who had developed a complete lack of empathy for their fellow human beings and who had come to view other people primarily as sources of profit and culinary ingredients. The family members showed no remorse for their crimes and seemed genuinely puzzled by the horror and revulsion that their actions provoked in others. They had created a private world in which cannibalism and murder were simply business practices, no different from any other aspect of restaurant operations. The arrest of the Boudreaux family on October 15, 1894, created a sensation that extended far beyond New Orleans and attracted international attention. The case had all the elements that fascinated the public. A respected business family revealed to be cannibalistic murderers, wealthy victims who had unknowingly consumed human flesh, and a criminal enterprise that had operated in plain sight for years. Newspapers across America and Europe carried detailed accounts of the investigation, often sensationalizing the more gruesome aspects of the case while struggling to comprehend how such horrors could occur in civilized society. The trial, which began in February 1895, revealed the full extent of the family's crimes and provided disturbing insights into their methods and motivations. Prosecutors presented evidence that the Boudreaux family had systematically murdered dozens of people over a 15-year period, had served human flesh to thousands of unsuspecting restaurant patrons, and had accumulated substantial wealth through their criminal activities. The physical evidence was overwhelming, including human remains found on the premises, personal effects belonging to victims, and detailed records that the family had kept of their operations. The defense attempted to argue that the family was suffering from a form of collective insanity that had been triggered by the trauma of losing their plantation and social position after the Civil War. They claimed that the family's actions were the result of mental illness rather than criminal intent, and that they should be treated as patients rather than criminals. However, the systematic nature of their crimes, the sophisticated planning involved, and their apparent understanding of right and wrong made this defense difficult to sustain. The testimony of surviving witnesses provided chilling insights into the family's operations and the narrow escapes of potential victims who had somehow avoided becoming targets. Several patrons testified that they had been invited to special dinners or private tastings but had declined for various reasons, decisions that had likely saved their lives. Others described conversations with family members that, in retrospect, seemed designed to gather information about their vulnerability and suitability as victims. The impact of the case on New Orleans society was profound and long-lasting. The revelation that one of the city's most respected restaurants had been serving human flesh created a crisis of confidence in the food service industry that took years to overcome. Many restaurants experienced significant declines in business as patrons became suspicious of any establishment that claimed to offer unique or secret recipes. The case also damaged New Orleans' reputation as a tourist destination, as visitors became wary of the city's famous culinary scene. The convictions of all four family members on multiple counts of murder in the first degree resulted in death sentences that were carried out in May 1895. The executions, conducted by hanging at the Orleans Parish Prison, drew crowds of thousands and were covered extensively by the national and international press. The Boudreaux family showed no remorse even in their final moments, maintaining that they had simply been conducting business in the most efficient way possible. The case had significant implications for food safety regulation and restaurant oversight throughout the United States. The ease with which the Boudreaux family had been able to operate undetected for so many years highlighted the need for more rigorous inspection procedures and better oversight of commercial food preparation. The case led to reforms in health department procedures, more frequent and thorough restaurant inspections, and new regulations governing the sourcing and handling of meat products. From a criminological perspective, the Boudreaux case provided early insights into what would later be recognized as serial killing behavior and organized criminal enterprises. The family's systematic approach to victim selection, their sophisticated methods for disposing of evidence, and their ability to maintain normal social relationships while committing horrific crimes would be studied by law enforcement professionals and criminal psychologists for decades to come. The case also highlighted the vulnerability of travelers and isolated individuals in an era before modern communication and identification systems. The victims of the Boudreaux family were able to disappear without immediate detection because they lacked the social connections and documentation systems that might have made their absence quickly apparent. This aspect of the case contributed to the development of better systems for tracking missing persons and protecting vulnerable travelers. The building that housed Chez Boudreaux was demolished shortly after the trial, as no one was willing to operate a business in a location associated with such horrific crimes. The site remained vacant for several years before being redeveloped, and today it houses a modern hotel that makes no reference to its dark history. However, the memory of the Boudreaux family's crimes remains part of New Orleans folklore, often told as a cautionary tale about the dangers of trusting appearances and the importance of remaining vigilant even in seemingly safe and respectable environments. The case of the Boudreaux family serves as a reminder that evil can hide behind facades of respectability and success, and that the most dangerous predators are often those who present themselves as pillars of their communities. Their ability to operate undetected for 15 years in one of America's most sophisticated cities demonstrates how easily trust can be exploited and how difficult it can be to recognize systematic criminal behavior when it is disguised as legitimate business activity. Today, as we continue to grapple with issues of food safety, consumer protection, and the vulnerability of travelers and isolated individuals, the case of the Boudreaux family provides valuable lessons about the importance of regulatory oversight, community awareness, and the need to remain vigilant even in seemingly safe environments. Their story reminds us that while the specific methods may change, the fundamental dynamics of predatory behavior remain constant across time and cultures. As you reflect on this disturbing chapter in New Orleans history, I encourage you to share your thoughts about how communities can better protect vulnerable individuals while maintaining the openness and hospitality that make places like New Orleans special. Have you ever encountered situations where something seemed too good to be true, in terms of exceptional service or unusual offerings? What warning signs do you think people should watch for when dining in unfamiliar establishments or dealing with businesses that seem to offer extraordinary value or unique experiences? Your insights and experiences can help create awareness that might prevent others from falling victim to similar deception and exploitation. The story of the Boudreaux family ultimately serves as both a cautionary tale and a call to vigilance, a reminder that we must balance our natural desire to trust and enjoy new experiences with a healthy skepticism about situations that seem too perfect or people who seem too interested in our personal affairs. In our modern world of global travel and instant communication, the specific vulnerabilities that made the Boudreaux family's victims susceptible to their crimes may have changed, but the fundamental human traits that predators exploit, loneliness, trust, and the desire for authentic experiences, remain as relevant today as they were in 1894 New Orleans.